All right. And then for the final sort of workshop, we're just going to finish up the Tailwind lecture that we were sort of halfway through yesterday. So we're going to go. So we're going to talk about animations. So this is how we sort of allow our HTML elements to move and also give it a bit of interactivity. So we're going to be looking at keyframes, how to call our animations, controlling the duration and the delay of those animations, as well as what we call timing functions. So if you haven't, make sure you open your browser and go to play.tailwindcss.com, and then update the code inside to match this. Give everyone 30 more seconds. All right. So let's first talk about keyframes. Keyframes basically describe sort of the animation that we're creating, and also control the properties of that animation at different points. So for example, we have this, let's open our CSS and we're gonna write this along. So we're defining keyframes for an animation that we're gonna call fade in. And essentially what you can do is you can specify percentages that represent like the completion or the progress of your animation, and then sort of define properties of whatever elements you're applying this animation to at that given progress point. So for here, you can see we have 0%. That means at the beginning of our animation, we want to have an opacity of 0. And then at 100%, we want to have an opacity of 1. So once we've done that, once we've defined our keyframes, we want to be able to actually call our animation. So inside our container class, we're going to write animation. We're going to call this animation fade in. And then animation duration is exactly what it sounds. It helps us tell the browser how long we want this to run. So let's do 5 seconds. And then we can also add a delay. So let's do 2 seconds. And then here are some timing functions. So you have a bunch of these, but we have ease, which is sort of the default animation, and it's sort of balanced. So you have like a slow start, and then a fast middle, and then a slow end. Whereas ease in, you have this sort of slow start that sort of ramps up, and then ease out, where it sort of slows down towards the end of the animation. And then you also have ease in and out, which is sort of like ease, like the default one, except it's a little bit more extreme. And then you have linear, which is, as you can expect, just a linear graph. So now we're going to talk about what I've kind of been using this whole time, which is Tailwind. It's a CSS library that's utility first, which means that instead of writing sort of classes to represent our CSS, we're using pre-made classes that represent a sort of attribute or property that helps make our development a lot quicker. So these are what we call utility classes, and it helps take away that sort of pain of trying to figure out what you want to name a CSS class. So it's pretty straightforward in that once you learn the naming scheme, you kind of understand what it does. So in this example, m-4 actually means you're adding a margin of 4 pixels on all sides. And these pre-made classes help make it really easy to not only write code quickly, but also stay consistent when it comes to your color choices, how you're spacing things, the typography, which is like the text, like the font that you're using, and a lot more. So what's really special about this library is that it's super low level in the sense that rather than creating some sort of abstract class that you apply to components, you're applying these really low level utility classes where you can sort of create components with these same utility classes and make them look very different. So if any of you have ever used Bootstrap, you'll kind of notice that they have these component templates. And that result is that you have these components that look kind of the same, even across sites, honestly. And they're kind of hard to modify because they've abstracted everything. And also, Tailwind reduces CSS bundle sizes. So Tailwind has its own compiler that basically discards any CSS that isn't being used. And the result of that is that you get smaller CSS bundles, and that results in faster load times, better performance, and your user's happy. Also, Tailwind's really great for responsive design. So if you've noticed any good website, if you open it on your phone versus your computer, everything should look fine and be functional. And that's what we call responsive design. And Tailwind has a lot of utility selectors to help make that happen. So if you haven't already, go back to your Tailwind CSS playground, play.tailwindcss.com, and we're going to try and replicate this tweet box from like Twitter using Tailwind CSS, and just going to show how quick and easy Tailwind can be. So before we get into actually building, in general, when you want to build something for web development, you always want to identify the structure, especially when you're trying to mimic something. So in this case, we should identify the structure and sort of the elements that make up this box before we actually try and build it. So we notice that, one, we have some giant container that has a little bit of padding, and that sort of holds all of our elements together. We have this bar at the top that has our button as well as the drafts button. And you can notice that they're sort of like in a line. We have the profile picture of the person that's writing the tweet. We have this text box area that allows us to actually write the tweet. We have this sort of box down here, which just indicates who can reply. And then we have another section down here, which is also like a bar, and that contains a bunch of controls for our tweet. So we should try and start from the top. So we're going to build our container first. So let's go back here. We're going to write this. So as you use Tailwind more, you'll sort of gain like an intuitive understanding of what things do. So for example, some of these are kind of self-explanatory, like BG Gray 900. If you hover over it, you can see what it does, but BG just stands for background. And then 900 is sort of like, kind of like a darkness level in a sense. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially you can think of it as different shades of a certain color. There's like blue, red, green, whatever. There's like a whole bunch of colors that they already have, but you can also extend your own. So it's fully customizable. So now we have our container. Let's start with making our top bar. So this is where we have the X button and the drafts button. So we want to think about what sort of goes inside here to tell the browser basically that we don't want these buttons together, but rather we want them as far apart as possible within our container. And this is what we call justify between. And this is essentially telling the browser for the children components inside, we want the browser to basically allow the maximum space possible between these two elements. So let's write that. So if you did that, you should notice at the top right here, we have this sort of dark bar, and it says drafts and close. You could use the like the icon if you want. For the sake of like time, I'm just putting the text there. But so that represents the top bar of our tweet container. So next, let's build the next element. So now we have the profile picture, and we're also going to have the text content. So let's add this container right here. It's going to represent sort of our profile picture and the text that we're going to write. So while you guys are writing that, I'll sort of give a quick rundown of like what these classes mean. So you'll notice there's a W16 and a height 16. That doesn't actually represent like 16 pixels. It's sort of a unit, and we're using REM, which is kind of like not necessarily pixels, but it's more proportional to like the elements that it's like being around. So it's more like you can think of it as like proportional sizing. And generally, Tailwind uses a like sort of scale that is sort of not only uniform and consistent, but also really good as far as like web standards. So they sort of take away that pain of like determining like how you want to scale different, like say headers, paragraphs. They sort of do that for you, and it just makes it a lot easier when we're trying to build something fast. Aspect square, you can just hover over and see, but it enforces an aspect ratio of 1:1. And then rounded full is essentially adding a border where we have like a really high border radius, and that essentially turns it into a circle. So we're not going to actually add an image, but you can just imagine that this circle is going to be where your person's image is. You can easily replace it with an image if you'd like, but we're just going to have that circle there to represent the image for now. So now that we have the profile picture, we want to add the text box where the person's going to be writing their tweet. So I'm going to just add some space here. So this is the profile picture container that we just wrote. And we're going to add the text area now for people to type their sort of tweet. And in general, if you ever are wondering like what a class does, you can always just hover over it, and then you'll see essentially what the actual like just vanilla CSS is doing. So in this case, you might be confused on what this sort of thing is here with the colon. So that's what we call like sort of like a query selector, or in this sense, we're basically determining like a certain event. So in this case, it's a focus event. The focus event is when you're actually like sort of either clicked in or like focusing, like if you use tab, for example. So in this case, we're focusing in this text area. And the default is you'll see this like blue outline. So all we're doing is that we're overriding that and saying when we're focused inside, we don't want to show an outline. And if I remove this, you'll actually see like if I click in, you'll see this sort of like outline around the box. It just looks kind of ugly, so that's why I'm hiding it, but that's what that does. And then you'll see right here, text 2XL. This is sort of the scaling system that I mentioned about Tailwind, where they've sort of determined like font sizes already for you, and sort of makes it easy to follow best practices. So here I'm just using text 2XL, and you can see this sort of scale that we're using here. All right. So now that we have the profile and picture and the text content of the tweet, now we want to add this who can reply indicator. So you can think of this as like another horizontal bar that goes right under both our image and our text content. So let's go under, we're going to go under the container, and we're going to add these two. So once you've done that, you should see something like this. You'll see the everyone can reply over here, and then you'll see this sort of horizontal line. That's what the HR element does. And then I think I talked about this before, but in general, if you just see M, that represents margin. And when you just use M dash and then a number, what that does is it applies margin to all four sides, so your top, bottom, left, and right. And you'll notice that the bar right here, it has margin on the sides as well as the top and bottom. But in this case, we only want to apply it on the top and bottom. So that's why we use Y to denote that in the Y direction we want margin. So if I change it to MY4, you'll notice that now there's no margin on the sides. If you notice this space right here, this is from the padding from our original container. So it's not actually the margin. But yeah. All right, and then finally we need to add our tweet controls and our post button. So let's make a container for that first because we have multiple elements there. We're going to use the nav element. And again, we're using justify between. So how you want to sort of think about how to structure this is I like to break it down into sort of the next subgroup. So if we have this giant group right here, you want to think of it as two groups. We have this group right here of icons that are sort of all stacked together. And then you have this group right here, which is just this post button. And as you can see, we have this space between. We want the browser to space these as far as possible. So that's why we have this sort of container. It's representing these two subgroups. And then from here, we'll make the containers for each subgroup. So first, we're going to do the first group on the left, which is all these icons. Again, I'm just going to use text to sort of symbolize what they are, but feel free to add the icons yourself. So we're going to add All right, so once you've done that, you should see the group on this side. You'll see that they are not that far, they're not spaced that far apart from each other, which is what we want, and that represents our first subgroup. And then we want the button on the right side. So let's add that as another container inside nav. In this case, since it's one element, we don't need to make a container. We can just add the element itself. So in this case, we're using a lot of things you've seen already. P in this case is just padding, which is inside the element, whereas margin is sort of outside the element. And then it follows the same sort of directional convention that margin uses. So in this case, we want our x padding to be 4 units. So that's why we're using px. And then py, we only want it to be half of that, which is why we're using that. And then we can just add the text for the button. And then if you're done, you should see something like this. So this is it took us maybe a few minutes with explaining to write this. So you can imagine if you actually knew the classes and you used Tailwind pretty frequently, you could build this in probably 30 seconds to a minute. So it's really, really fast and really easy to build. And yeah, that's sort of the benefit of Tailwind and why, honestly, I personally use it. I think it just takes away a lot of the pain of, trying to name your classes. And also another thing that I think is like not really mentioned, but if you notice, the whole time while we were writing our HTML, which is what we're using a lot in React, you stayed in the same file. We didn't have to navigate to the CSS tab and then like write our CSS classes and then come back. That's like sort of like one of the biggest benefits about Tailwind is that you get to write in the HTML itself. And I think that just makes development a lot quicker, a lot more seamless. I think it's just a better experience in general. It's definitely not mandatory, but I would highly suggest you try it in your own projects. And yeah, so this is the final code. If you didn't get it, you can also see the result at weblab.is/tailwind. Yeah, that was the lecture. And then feedback, please leave feedback on this lecture, how it went. If it was too fast, too slow, anything you liked, anything you disliked. And yeah.